Okay, so we have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and today we have Steven here. Steven's the editor at large at Wired, one of my favorite tech publications to read. I've been a reader, since I was a kid. You've been looking at your work for some time for sure. You've authored many different books. In the Plex, which was the bestseller in 2011. You've really kind of predicted also crypto before crypto even became big. Rediscovered Einstein's brain. I mean, there's so many incredible things you've done, Steven. So I'm excited again to your story. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Awesome. So, how did your passion for technology and journalism start? Did you like receive some sort of tech device and you kind of got interested in it? Like, how did this all begin?
So I was a general interest journalist for a number of years. I went to grad school in literature and decided that academia wasn't for me and went back to my hometown, Philadelphia, and started writing, taught myself how to be a magazine writer. And I was into it for a few years when I got an assignment to write about these people called computer hackers. And this is
Huh.
in 1981. And I really hadn't heard of these people. It wasn't a popular term then. Back then, when you used the term, it referred to people who were computer addicts. It wasn't really a nice thing to say about people. It implied that they were like these losers that couldn't participate in society. But I looked into it and started working on a story for Rolling Stone about them. That's where I took the assignment. And I was just blown away by the whole world of computers, digital technology, and the people who really got it and who did amazing things with computers. So I thought, gee, I want to do more and more about that. Right, I went to California to research it. And just when I got back, I said to my girlfriend, who's now my wife, we've got to get computers. We bought a pair of Apple IIs and we learned word processing, which is what you did back then.
Right. So now you kind of have a little bit of insight into what these people are all, excited about. Like, what were some of the next steps in terms of like you determining what you even wanted to write about in the space and where you even wanted to what topics to focus on? Like, how did you figure that out?
So it was a really interesting time. This is the early 80s. Personal computers are just becoming, I wouldn't even say popular, but becoming something that some people were adopting. And businesses started to look into them, and some people started to buy them. So there was a hunger to learn about those. And I was in a great position of someone who had established myself to some degree as a writer that communicated with general interest audiences. And whereas most people in what was known as computer journalism at that time, not only the thing they called the journalists, were sort of from the hobbyist world. So the thing was shifting there. So there was a hunger for people to learn about what these things were about, as well as to learn the stories of the people who were creating them. And I was really well placed to do that and got to know a lot of the really important people in that world very early on as a representative of places like Rolling Stone or Esquire or the places I was writing for. And I also started writing for a computer magazine called Popular Computing at the time. So and then I got a request to write a book about hackers, and that really
Huh.
took me deep into the rabbit hole. I really looked into the origins of computer culture and came out with this book in 1984 called Hackers, which is still pretty popular and pretty widely read within that world.
hmm Based on what your research of the space, around 1984 when you put out the Hackers book, I mean, how much has changed currently in the tech space in terms of like the way things are made and created and the people behind them, than how much has changed in the culture, et cetera?
I mean, massive changes. It was very much an outsider culture when I was writing about it. And most people didn't understand what these folks in Silicon Valley or Seattle or other places were doing. They were just trying to figure out how to use these things. You had to type in
Yeah.
weird codes in order to get it going, and then you would print it out on these dot matrix printers that just printed a little constellation of dots. I remember when I wrote Hackers and handed it to the publisher, my publisher would not accept the dot matrix printer that I had. They said this doesn't look like a real manuscript. So I had to rent what was known as a daisy wheel printer, which created what looked like a typewritten copy. And it was very slow. It took a whole weekend to print out the book. So you had to decode it. So lots of things were different back then. And just the beginnings of these companies that were beginning to go public, like Apple and Microsoft, which went public in 1977, I believe, maybe 1978. They were just starting to become legitimate concerns. And back then, also, uh, hackers was wrestling with the idea of whether you could really be a hacker and make a lot of money doing it. It was sort of at odds because it sort of violated uh, some ethical principles that some people had that, gee, this is sort of holy. And, I really can't be doing it to make a lot of money. One thing that we've gotten past now is, yes, you could be a hacker and make lots and lots and lots of money. You could be a billionaire and you could still be a hacker. So I think that's changed. But what hasn't changed is really great in that wizardry on the computer and coding is still very highly valued. Doing amazing things with digital technology is still what drives that world and now our world. So, well, it's become really a mainstream, if not the mainstream pursuit. Some of the magic is still there.
So how did your relationship with Apple start? And like, how did you get involved in reviewing their products so early on? I mean, you were, I think, one of the first four people to review the iPhone. How did that all begin?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was involved with Apple way before that. When I started writing about it, Apple was the company which was most aligned with the element of the computer revolution that had been tied to the counterculture where I came of age. I went to college in the late 60s, early 70s. It was very much part of that revolution and music and culture, the whole bit. So Apple had that flair to it. So I was interested in them from the start. I remember hanging around there, and of course, Steve Wozniak was a very big source for hackers. So I got into the company that way, learning about the people. I remember I was the first person at Rolling Stone to learn about this big rock festival that Steve Wozniak was sponsoring called the US Festival. It was the biggest festival in the United States since Woodstock. And told them about it, wound up covering that for Rolling Stone. So I knew a lot about it and looked with very much a lot of interest when they were developing the Macintosh, and actually wrote the story about the Macintosh launch for Rolling Stone. I got in before it launched, and that's where I really met Steve Jobs. And that was in late 83 for a story that came out in early 1984 when the Macintosh launched. So, and I wrote a column beginning in 1985 for Macworld. So I was like super familiar with the company and a lot of its products way before the iPhone in 2007, which I reviewed for Newsweek. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple in 1997, I was at Newsweek then. I was the main technology writer. And Steve knew who I was and was happy that I was at a place where he wanted to be. He only took a few publications seriously, and Newsweek was one of them. So when he began to talk about what he was doing at Apple, he called me to Cupertino. That was when the iMac was coming out, and I spent a few days with him. And during my whole time at Newsweek, we were very close. And every time Apple would come out with something new, he'd summon me and I'd get an advanced look, or at the least, I'd go to his keynote and meet him afterwards, and he'd give me a personal showing.
Mhm. When looking at a product like the Macintosh, did you think that this was going to really transform computing right away, or did you think it would have like some sort of influence on it, but it would take some time? Like, what were kind of your initial thoughts there?
Well, you could read the article. I was on the record saying this is a big deal and it's going to change computers forever. And, I was talking about the graphical user interface, bit mapping on the screen, the mouse, cursor control externally. These were all things that the computers did not have before, not commercial computers and personal computers. They were in the lab, and Xerox had a very high priced computer that used that mode of computing. But recognized right away, it turned out to be correct, that this was a big inflection point for computers, and it's going to make them more mainstream, more popular, and more fun.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you did really pick up on that right away, but I think it's like, you seem to also really have a great understanding of like where this would be most impactful. I mean, there was such a consumer revolution that occurred because of that device, and it was very much something that like I think you had a lot of insight in early on. Yeah, it seems like also with crypto, you had a great insight into crypto before even like Bitcoin came about, and you put out a book earlier on about that. Why did you just think it was like a very much privacy focused movement that made sense? Like, what drew you towards crypto initially?
Well, when Wired started, I was a freelancer at the time. I was listed as a contributing writer from the first issue. And I wrote the second cover story about these people called cypherpunks. Again, very counterculture kind of thing. And I got the assignment. Kevin Kelly actually suggested I do it. He was the executive editor of Wired at the time. And he said, we're starting this new magazine. It's going to be like the Rolling Stone of technology. Here's a great story for you to do. It's like the hackers and, and this thing called cryptography that they're doing. And I thought, well, I don't know about this magazine. What's going to happen with that? It sounds a little dicey, but I'll do it because I like Kevin. Of course, here I am at Wired 30 years later. But I did that story and became fascinated with the subject of cryptography and learned the story about how in the late 70s, a group of people took it out of the hands of government, which had this monopoly and tried to prosecute people who would do research in it, and developed outside of the government bounds a way to do cryptography on a massive scale, which, as it turns out, we were going to need when the internet became popular and when people went online. So it was a political thing in part, which led me to write about that. And all during the 90s, I wrote about crypto for Wired. And, about halfway through, decided, yeah, I should do a book on this. And as part of that, besides the privacy angle, I realized that cryptography enables you to do a lot of really cool things digitally online that not only can match some of the things we use in the real world for things like contracts and other things, even money, but surpass them with things like smart contracts and the kinds of things that you just started talking about a few years ago with the blockchain. So the book pretty explicitly anticipated that stuff, even though the book was now like 22 years old.
Yeah. I mean, when you were also diving into this, like, did you think that this would be done like, kind of through the typical tech company way of somebody creating like a Bitcoin currency, or did you think it would be even like, somebody embracing it in a completely outsider approach to create these types of technologies to take advantage of smart contracts, things like that, in the way that Bitcoin was done anonymously?
Well, there was kind of a struggle going on at that time in the mid to late 90s about what digital cash would look like. That's what they called it then. I wrote a story for Newsweek in 1995, I think, called "The End of Money." I did one for Wired in 1994 called, eCash. So I was writing about the origins of digital currency, and there's a question of whether it would be anonymous or not. Whether it would be something that preserved people's privacy or gave it up. I didn't really anticipate, mainly because it's such a stupid thing to have, that the currencies themselves would become objects of speculation, right? That people would, buy these digital currencies, as an investment tool, the investment, to see whether they would go up in price, and you'd hold it, and going to be worth more. And again, that's kind of like a dumb use for it, which I think has really hampered its use, its adoption, because uh, if that spending some digital currency might lead you 10 years later to say, oh, I can't believe I bought a pizza and it's now worth $20,000. Uh, uh, you're less likely to spend it, something like that. And same with NFTs, right? I mean, you're less likely to appreciate just the coolness of an NFT if you see it as an investment vehicle to say, well, if I buy this and hold it, it might be worth many, many more times what I'm spending for it.
Yeah. Yeah, there is that kind of tie-in in the industry for sure, but I think the value of what it provides as a collectible, or even the transactional value, it's just that's the aspect to focus on. It doesn't get focused on enough. I totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in terms of like writing a story and creating a journalistic piece, you've written so many different types of stories about so many different types of products. What really like are some of the initial steps, and how do you structure a story to make it have the most amount of reach and most amount of interest to the widest audiences on a particular topic? Like, what are some things that go into that to do it well?
Well, I really believe that long form story in particular has to have a strong narrative. There's got to be a reason to drive the reader to go from paragraph to paragraph. And, at Wired, we have great editors that really reinforce that structure, which, it's kind of second nature to me now. I've written hundreds of these stories. But what you do when you research is you approach your subject uh, once you determine that, gee, I think this is pretty interesting, it's going to be a story, then to kind of go with an open mind. Because the reality of what you find when you do reporting is always, without exception, more interesting than any preconception you might have about what the story might look like, right? When you just think in terms of saying, oh, what would a story be, if I were writing a screenplay or something like that, you would think formulaic, right? But real life is much more interesting. It's got twists and turns. So you just keep your eyes and ears open when you're reporting, and you try to divine what that story is, what that narrative is, uh, beneath all the information you're accumulating. And as you listen to people and learn surprising stuff, just like dipping, like an old style photograph into developing fluid, it become clear, right? You see the outlines of here's your story, here's the story I want to tell. So it's important. It's hard to do it if you're writing a story in a couple days, like sometimes you have to do it Newsweek. But at Wired, I have the luxury sometimes to take months for a story. I'll work on several at once, where those lines become clear, and you're able to write the story, and I can unfold it with all the novel things you've learned during the course of research.
Mhm. And how different is it, Stephen, for creating a book? Is it this a similar process to be able to get to understand the content, to go research it, to be open minded like that? But how about when you're structuring your story and trying to entice the reader? How much different is it?
Well, it's even more important to have an open mind during a book, because what you're doing is you're diving and really trying to become the world's expert on that subject, right? So when I did my book about Google, um, I spent years talking to hundreds of people at Google and got the view from Google, um, as best you could possibly have without working there, right? And in some aspects, a better view, because I was able to talk to anyone. There's the corporate bounds and silos didn't apply to me. And I could talk to Larry and Sergey, and I could also talk to some engineer somewhere. And, so they gave me unbelievable access, and I was able to figure out, this what this company is really about. And I was able to identify, to me, sort of the crucible of Google, which at the time was their experience in China, where their morals and their came to be tested, and whether they were going to determine whether they were going to be evil or not. And wound up spending a lot of time in China documenting that. So, which is something I didn't think when I started. When I wrote about Facebook, I started researching that book in the end of the summer of 2016. A few months later, the election came, and the whole narrative changed. as a lot of fingers pointed at Facebook as well. That's why Trump got elected. That's, you screwed things up. You took people's privacy, and the company was under unbelievable scrutiny at the time that I was uh, talking to all the employees there and researching it, talking to Mark Zuckerberg, I think 9 times during the course of the book. And I was a little worried for a while that they throw me out, but I guess by that point they figured I knew too much anyway, so why not just go with it? Uh, so, that was a big change that I rolled with.
So just on a bit of a separate topic, so the discovery of Einstein's brain. You kind of you figured out where it was. You had to track it down, and then it's interesting because it kind of became this majorly culturally significant thing to have Einstein's brain, to study his brain. Why do you think it wasn't? There wasn't any kind of focus on even retrieving it before you found it. It didn't seem like there was that much substantial interest in it, and then all of a sudden when we found it, and then there was all this renewed interest. Why do you think that kind of happened?
Well, people kind of forgot, most people forgot, if they knew it to begin with, that Einstein's brain was removed after he died, and my editor came across a line in a biography of Einstein just saying the brain was removed, and he kind of wondered, it was over 20 years since that happened, what happened there, what studies came of it. And he tried to find some scientific study or something, and he found nothing about it. And then gave me the assignment to go find Einstein's brain. I figured out who had the brain. It was the pathologist who removed it from Einstein's head in 1955. He had dropped off the map, so it really became a search for him in the pre-Google days. And I eventually located him. At first, he denied he had the brain, but then I said, well, I'm going to go visit you. And after a long back and forth, it turned out he did have the brain, and he showed me the brain. And I wrote about it. It became international news. People were camped out on his lawn. Johnny Carson made a joke about it. And some scientists read about it and asked him for pieces of the brain so they could study it. But also became a big cultural thing. There are books called Einstein's Brain, plays, songs, everything, and it became a huge thing.
Yeah. So after this, it was kind of found and everything. I mean, so was your goal to really write up to write up on it, etc. But like, were there other goals you kind of had in seeing seeing that maybe the brain go to be studied in different places, seeing what was possible? Like, were you kind of like trying to push for it to be in those areas? Like, what did you want to do with it, basically?
Well, I mean, in the short term, that was like a one-off. I just did the story,
Hmm.
and it ran, and about maybe uh, some years later, probably almost 20 years later, one of the things published about it came out. A significant study by one of the top brain researchers. I was at Newsweek then and wrote an article about it. But I think for me, the lasting effect of that was, besides having a cool story to tell at dinner, uh, I, it led me to think about, gee, Einstein's brain, which really didn't have significant differences from a quote normal brain. People did find some anomalies in years to come, but nothing that really would explain Einstein. But it made me wonder what made Einstein Einstein, right? Why does that brain come up with things that no other brain came up with? And I would later ask the same question about Steve Jobs, who was a really uniquely driven person and with a very prodigious and specific talents. Well, and also just this drive and this focus that very few people had. And I don't know what made Steve Jobs, right? So that's something that's uh, puzzled me, and something I work to get to the bottom of a lot when I write a story, is trying to understand some of these extraordinary people I write about, and really try to figure it out in the context of that bigger question of what makes us us. And this is a question now that really comes to the fore as I write and ponder artificial intelligence.
Hmm. Yeah, just the last question that I have, Stephen. So with seeing the developments of ChatGPT and OpenAI, you covered Google quite intensely with In the Plex book. You interviewed hundreds of people. You spent years on it, et cetera. I mean, do you think that the ChatGPT is really the future of search and the way we interact with the web, or do you think it's like kind of building out its own category?
A little of both. I think we're in a period of flux as we're trying to figure out how to use this technology. Right now, it isn't necessarily the most effective way to do searches. For one thing, you can't trust what it says, so it's not too good. If you're looking for an answer to something and it makes something up, you can't take that to the bank. I couldn't put it in a story and trust that it was true. But I think it's a bigger question. I mean, what else is generative AI going to replace? And what's going to be built on top of generative AI? And at some point, we're going to turn over a lot of what we do to AI, where AI is going to be talking to AI and we're going to be spectators. So that'll be uncomfortable. Really, the question of whether ChatGPT could ultimately replace search is something that leads to a bigger question. Right now, in the short term, no, it can't, because for one thing, it makes things up. And when you search for something, you like to know the actual true answer to things. You don't like to have facts that it just fabricated. Also, sometimes when you search, you're looking for a lot of alternatives rather than one straight answer there. But I do think that its impressive ability to take a huge amount of information and boil it down to something coherent in just plain natural language indicates that something really remarkable is going on here. It blows the Turing test out of the water, just on a minute to minute basis. And I think much bigger than whether we'll search with it is how much of this is going to affect everything we do in our lives, right? And we're all going to have these assistants that use AI, and increasingly the assistants are going to be talking to other assistants. We're going to be spectators in discourse between different AIs talking to each other. And that's a weird place for humanity to be.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, Stephen, I appreciate you coming on. I think you have, really great insights into the tech field. You've spent probably some of the most time of anybody in the world studying this space, being immersed with the creators of these products in this space, the products themselves. And I think it provides really great insight into various different fields and into your coverage of these different topics. But people can find your work on Wired.com. You put out articles, consistently, in-depth articles, long stories, and they're fascinating. So I hope that people do
Right.
check them out, and I
Yeah,
appreciate
I
you
hope
coming
that
on.
when they, if I do a weekly newsletter called Plain Text that goes out to all Wired subscribers, and there's an introductory rate of like $5 or $10 for a year, which gives you not only my newsletter but all of Wired online and the print magazine. So that can't be beat.